They said I couldn't even carry groceries without help. 3 months later, I was dragging 4 bleeding soldiers through enemy territory while mortars exploded around us. The helmet cam footage would eventually reach 50 million views. But that night in Afghanistan, all I could think about was proving my father wrong. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and for 23 years, my family treated me like I was made of glass. Growing up in Bakersfield, California, I was the youngest of 4 kids and the only girl. My brothers Jake, Marcus, and Tony were all built like linebackers. Just like our dad, Rick Mitchell, who'd spent 15 years as a Marine before opening his auto repair shop downtown. Me? I barely scraped 5'2" and weighed maybe 110 pounds soaking wet. While my brothers were out playing football and wrestling in the backyard, I was reading books in my room or helping Mom with cooking. Not because I wanted to, but because every time I tried to join their games, someone would inevitably say, "Sarah, you're gonna get hurt. Go help your mother." The comments started early and never stopped. When I was 12 and wanted to try out for the middle school soccer team, Dad shook his head. "Sweetheart, those girls are gonna run you over. Maybe try the debate team instead." When I expressed interest in rock climbing at 16, my brother Jake laughed. "Sarah, you can barely open a pickle jar. What makes you think you can hang off a cliff?" Even simple household tasks became exercises in family doubt. I'd reach for a case of water at the grocery store, and Mom would immediately intervene. "Let Marcus get that, honey. You'll throw out your back." When we moved furniture, I wasn't even asked to help. "Sarah, you just direct traffic. Tell us where everything goes." The worst part wasn't the constant protection. It was how it made me see myself. By the time I turned 18, I genuinely believed I was fragile. I avoided physical challenges, opted out of activities that seemed too demanding, and found myself gravitating toward the sidelines of life. I'd convinced myself that everyone else was right, that I simply wasn't built for anything requiring real strength or endurance. College didn't change much. I studied communications at UC Davis, lived in the quietest dorm I could find, and spent most of my time in the library. My roommate, Jessica Chen, was training for marathons and constantly invited me to join her morning runs. "Thanks, but I'm not really a runner," I'd say, already imagining myself collapsing after half a mile. Jessica would shrug and head out alone, returning an hour later glowing with endorphins while I nursed my second cup of coffee. The breaking point came during my junior year at Thanksgiving dinner. The whole family was gathered around Dad's massive dining room table. All my brothers had brought their girlfriends, and everyone was sharing stories about their accomplishments. Jake had just gotten promoted to sergeant in the police department. Marcus was starting his own construction company. Tony had completed his EMT certification and was working for the county fire department. When the conversation turned to me, I mentioned that I'd made the dean's list again and was considering graduate school. Dad nodded approvingly, but then Jake's girlfriend Amanda asked if I'd ever thought about following the family tradition of public service. "Sarah's not really built for that kind of work," Dad said, cutting into his turkey. "She's got brains, but she's delicate, always has been. Better she sticks to what she's good at, thinking, not doing." The table went quiet for a moment. I felt my cheeks burning as everyone nodded in agreement. Even my mother, who I'd always counted on for support, just smiled sympathetically and patted my hand. "Your father's right, sweetheart. You've got other strengths." That night, lying in my childhood bedroom staring at the ceiling, something inside me snapped. Not in an angry way, but in a clarifying way. I realized I'd spent my entire life accepting other people's limitations as facts about myself. I'd never actually tested whether I was as weak as everyone claimed. I'd just taken their word for it, and built my entire identity around being the fragile one. The next morning, I drove to the Army recruitment office in downtown Bakersfield. Staff Sergeant Williams, a no-nonsense woman in her 40s, looked me up and down when I walked in. "What can I do for you, miss?" "I want to enlist," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. She raised an eyebrow. "Any particular reason? College? Not working out?" "I need to find out what I'm actually capable of," I replied. "I've been told my whole life that I'm too weak for anything challenging. I want to know if that's true." Staff Sergeant Williams studied me for a long moment, then pulled out a stack of paperwork. Well, the Army's got a way of answering that question real quick. You sure you're ready for that answer? I thought about Dad's dismissive tone, about all the times I'd been told to step aside and let someone stronger handle things, about how I'd spent 23 years being a spectator in my own life. I'm sure. The paperwork took 3 hours. Physical examination, aptitude tests, background checks, family medical history. When I mentioned that my father was a Marine veteran, Sergeant Williams perked up. Military family, huh? What's he think about you enlisting? He doesn't know yet, I admitted, and when he finds out, he's going to try to talk me out of it. She chuckled. Parents always worry, but if you're serious about this, you better be prepared for basic training. It's not a game, and it doesn't care about your feelings. You'll either rise to the challenge or wash out. Simple as that. I signed the papers that afternoon, choosing military police as my desired military occupational specialty. The ship-out date was set for February 15th, giving me 2 months to finish my fall semester and prepare for what everyone would undoubtedly see as the biggest mistake of my life. Breaking the news to my family went exactly as expected. Dad was furious, convinced I'd lost my mind. Sarah, you can't be serious. You'll last maybe a week before they send you home. This isn't a game. People get hurt in the military. Mom cried, certain I was throwing away my future. You're so close to graduating college, why would you risk everything for this? My brothers were split between concern and amusement. Jake thought I was having some kind of breakdown. Marcus bet Tony $20 that I'd be back home within a month. Only Tony seemed to understand, or at least respect, my decision. Look, sis, he said after the family drama had died down, I think you're crazy, but I also think you need to do this. Just be careful, okay? And don't let them break you down too much before you figure out what you're made of. Those words stuck with me through the final weeks of college, through Christmas break filled with worried looks and hushed conversations, and through the long flight to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, where my new life would begin. I had no idea if my family was right about my limitations, but I was finally going to find out. Fort Leonard Wood in February felt like stepping into another planet. The Missouri winter bit through every layer of clothing I owned, and the reception station buzzed with nervous energy from dozens of recruits who looked just as terrified as I felt. Most of them were 18, fresh out of high school, while I stood there at 23 feeling ancient and completely out of place. The first shock came during in-processing when they handed me my gear. The rucksack alone weighed more than some of the textbooks I'd struggled to carry across campus. The drill sergeants moved through our group like predators sizing up prey, and I caught more than one skeptical glance in my direction. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, a compact woman with arms that looked like they could snap telephone poles, stopped in front of me. Mitchell, right? California girl? Her voice carried the kind of authority that made your spine straighten automatically. Yes, drill sergeant. She circled me slowly, taking in my civilian clothes and probably calculating how quickly I'd crack. You sure you're in the right place, recruit? The college campus is about 200 miles that way. I'm sure, drill sergeant. We'll see. She moved on, but I felt her watching me for the rest of the day. Basic training started at 0430 hours the next morning, with what they cheerfully called a, quote, wake-up call. Drill sergeants bursting through the barracks, screaming at the top of their lungs while banging metal trash can lids together. My bunkmate, a girl named Ashley Reeves from Georgia, who'd grown up hunting and fishing, was already sitting up and reaching for her boots. I was still trying to figure out which way was up. The first week nearly broke me. Physical training sessions that left me gasping while others barely seemed winded. Obstacle courses designed to humble anyone who thought they knew their limits. Endless marching with full gear that made my shoulders feel like they were being crushed. Every night I collapsed into my bunk wondering if Dad had been right all along. But something strange happened around day 10. During our morning run, I realized I wasn't falling behind anymore. My breathing had regulated, my legs had stopped screaming, and I was actually keeping pace with the middle of the pack. Ashley noticed too. Damn, Mitchell. You've got some fight in you after all, she said as we cooled down. First week, I thought you'd be on a bus home by Friday. The obstacle course was where things really clicked. The rope climb had been my nemesis. 20 feet of thick manila rope that might as well have been Mount Everest. For 2 weeks, I'd barely made it halfway before my grip gave out. Then one morning, something shifted. Instead of trying to muscle my way up like the bigger recruits, I focused on technique. Small movements, efficient grip changes, using my legs to take pressure off my arms. When I rang the bell at the top, Drill Sergeant Rodriguez was waiting at the bottom with something that might have been approval in her eyes. "Not bad, Mitchell. You're learning to work smarter instead of harder. Take notes, people. Sometimes technique beats brute force." That comment changed everything. I started approaching every challenge differently, analyzing what I could do within my physical limitations, rather than trying to overcome them through pure strength. During ruck marches, while others powered through with raw endurance, I perfected my stride and gear distribution. In hand-to-hand combat training, I learned to use momentum and leverage against bigger opponents. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. My platoon started noticing. Jenny Walsh, a former college volleyball player from Ohio, began asking for my help with navigation exercises. "You see patterns the rest of us miss," she said, after I'd helped her squad cut 15 minutes off their time during a land navigation course. By week 8, I'd stopped being the weak link and started becoming an asset. Not because I'd suddenly gotten stronger than everyone else. I was still one of the smallest in our company, but because I'd learned to maximize what I had. More importantly, I'd stopped believing the story my family had told me about myself. Graduation day brought mixed emotions. My parents flew out for the ceremony, along with Jake and his wife. Seeing me in dress blues seemed to confuse them more than anything else. Dad kept looking at me like I was someone he didn't quite recognize. "You look different," Mom said during our brief visit afterward. "I feel different," I replied, and it was true. Something fundamental had shifted during those 10 weeks. I carried myself differently, spoke with more confidence, and had developed an unshakable belief that I could figure out how to handle whatever came my way. Military police school at Fort Leonard Wood was a different kind of challenge. Less about breaking you down and rebuilding you, more about teaching practical skills for law enforcement in military environments. We learned everything from traffic control to combat patrols, from evidence collection to crowd control techniques. My instructors were all combat veterans, and their stories painted a picture of military police work that went far beyond what I'd expected. Sergeant First Class Martinez had deployed to Iraq 3 times and spoke casually about convoy security missions where his team had come under fire. Staff Sergeant Thompson shared stories from Afghanistan about base security operations that turned into firefights, with insurgents trying to breach the perimeter. "The thing about being an MP," Sergeant Martinez told our class during a particularly intense training session, "is that you never know when you're going to transition from keeping the peace to fighting for your life. One minute you're checking IDs at a gate, the next minute you're calling for backup because someone's shooting at you." The combat training intensified accordingly. We spent hours at the firing range until shooting became muscle memory. Close quarters combat scenarios taught us to clear buildings and engage targets in confined spaces. First aid training went beyond basic medical care to include battlefield trauma treatment, how to stop arterial bleeding, treat gunshot wounds, and keep someone alive until a medic arrived. It was during one of these medical training exercises that I met Corporal David Chen, no relation to my college roommate Jessica. David was an Army medic cross-training with our MP company, and he had an easy laugh that made even the grimmest training scenarios seem manageable. "You've got steady hands," he observed after watching me practice applying pressure bandages to simulated wounds. "Most people get shaky when there's fake blood everywhere, but you stay focused." We started spending time together outside of training, grabbing coffee at the post exchange, comparing notes on our different specialties, sharing stories about our families. David grew up in Portland, Oregon, the son of 2 emergency room doctors who'd expected him to follow in their footsteps. Instead, he'd chosen military medicine, wanting to help people in extreme situations rather than routine hospital work. "My parents think I'm crazy," he admitted one evening as we walked around the base. "They can't understand why I'd choose to patch people up in war zones when I could have a nice, safe practice somewhere." "Sounds familiar," I replied, thinking about my family's reaction to my enlistment. "Sometimes you have to disappoint people to find out who you really are." Graduation from MP school came with orders that would determine the next chapter of my military career. When I opened my assignment envelope, I saw 3 words that made my heart race. Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Home of the 82nd Airborne Division, and one of the most deployment-heavy bases in the Army. David got Fort Campbell, Kentucky. Close enough that we promised to stay in touch, far enough that our budding relationship would be tested by distance. More importantly, both assignments meant we'd likely deploy to combat zones within our first year. The phone call home to share my new orders was predictably difficult. Dad's voice carried a mixture of pride and terror when I told him about Fort Bragg. "Sarah, I need you to understand something," he said, his Marine training showing through. "Where you're going, people don't come back the same. Some don't come back at all. Are you ready for that?" Quote. For the first time in our relationship, I felt like he was talking to me as an equal rather than a fragile child who needed protection. "I'm as ready as anyone can be, Dad, and I'm not the same person who left California 6 months ago." "No," he said quietly, "I can hear that. Just be careful out there, and remember that being tough doesn't mean being stupid. Trust your training, trust your team, and come home in one piece." 2 weeks later, I was driving across North Carolina toward my new life, my car packed with everything I owned, and my head full of possibilities I'd never imagined back in Bakersfield. The GPS estimated 4 hours to Fort Bragg, but I took my time, stopping at roadside diners and small towns along the way. This was my first real taste of independence. Not college independence, where my parents were a phone call away, but genuine adult responsibility for my own life and decisions. As I crossed the state line into North Carolina, I realized I was no longer running away from my family's expectations. I was running towards something I couldn't yet define, but knew I had to find. Fort Bragg sprawled across the horizon like a small city, and somewhere in that maze of buildings and training areas was my future. Whatever it held, I was ready to meet it head-on. Fort Bragg hit me like a slap of humid North Carolina air and the constant rumble of helicopters overhead. The 503rd Military Police Battalion became my new home, and within hours of checking in, I knew this wasn't going to be like the controlled environment of training. Real soldiers with real deployment patches and real stories filled the hallways, and I was the fresh-faced newbie trying to prove I belonged. My first squad leader was Staff Sergeant Patricia Vega, a 7-year veteran with 2 Afghanistan deployments under her belt. She had the kind of presence that made rooms go quiet when she walked in, and she sized me up with the cold efficiency of someone who'd learned not to waste time on people who wouldn't last. "Mitchell, you're riding with Kowalski today," she announced during my first morning formation. "He'll show you how we do business around here. Try not to embarrass yourself." Specialist Brian Kowalski turned out to be a 25-year-old from Detroit who joined the Army after losing his factory job. He had the laid-back demeanor of someone who'd seen enough to know when to worry and when to relax, and he treated my arrival with bemused tolerance. "So you're the college girl who thinks she wants to be a cop," he said as we climbed into our patrol vehicle. "What made you give up the easy life for this?" "Wanted to see what I was made of," I replied, adjusting my gear vest. He laughed, but not unkindly. "Well, you picked the right place for that. This base sees more action than most people realize. We've got Special Forces training operations, airborne exercises, and enough drunk paratroopers on the weekends to keep things interesting." The first month at Bragg was a crash course in real-world military policing. Gate duty meant checking hundreds of IDs while staying alert for potential security threats. Patrol calls ranged from domestic disputes in base housing to traffic accidents involving military vehicles worth more than most people's houses. I learned to navigate the complex hierarchy of military ranks and units, understanding when to be firm and when to show flexibility. But it was the training exercises that really opened my eyes to what lay ahead. Joint training operations with infantry units meant learning to operate in combat environments while maintaining law enforcement responsibilities. We practiced securing landing zones for helicopter insertions, establishing vehicle checkpoints in hostile territory, and coordinating with combat units during simulated attacks on forward operating bases. During one particularly intense exercise, our squad was tasked with establishing security for a medical evacuation point while under simulated enemy fire. The scenario involved multiple casualties from an IED explosion, complete with Hollywood-quality special effects makeup and actors screaming in fake pain. My job was to secure the perimeter while medics worked on the wounded. The chaos was overwhelming. Smoke grenades created a haze that made visibility nearly impossible. Blank rounds fired from multiple directions created a constant din of gunfire. Radio chatter filled my headset with overlapping voices calling for backup, medical support, and ammunition resupply. In the middle of it all, I had to maintain situational awareness and keep potential threats away from the casualty collection point. Something clicked during that exercise. Instead of getting overwhelmed by the chaos, I found myself processing information in layers. Background noise became manageable. The constant motion around me resolved into patterns I could predict and respond to. When Staff Sergeant Vega appeared at my position to check on my sector, she found me calmly directing traffic while maintaining clear sightlines on potential approach routes. "Not bad, Mitchell," she said after the exercise ended. "You kept your head when things got loud. That's harder than most people think." The compliment meant more than she probably realized. For the first time since arriving at Bragg, I felt like I was beginning to earn my place rather than just occupying it. 3 months into my assignment, the deployment orders came down. The 503rd was tasked with providing military police support for combat operations in Afghanistan. Our mission would involve everything from convoy security to base defense, from detainee operations to civil affairs coordination with local Afghan authorities. The deployment briefings painted a picture of a complex security environment where the line between law enforcement and combat operations blurred constantly. Forward Operating Base Shank in Lagar Province would be our home for the next 12 months, and the intelligence reports made it clear that we'd be operating in an active combat zone where Taliban fighters regularly attacked coalition forces. "This isn't going to be like stateside duty," Staff Sergeant Vega told our squad during one of many pre-deployment briefings. "Over there, every patrol could turn into a firefight. Every checkpoint could be a target for suicide bombers. Every person you interact with could be planning to kill you. You need to be switched on 100% of the time, because letting your guard down for 5 seconds can get you and your teammates killed." The training intensified accordingly. Live fire exercises became daily events. Combat medical training expanded to cover battlefield trauma care under fire. We practiced immediate action drills until we could execute them in our sleep. What to do when your convoy hits an IED, how to respond to small arms fire from multiple directions, procedures for calling in air support and medical evacuation. Physical fitness took on new urgency as well. The gear we'd carry in Afghanistan was heavier than anything we'd used in training. Body armor, ammunition, water, medical supplies, communications equipment, and weapons added up to more than 60 pounds of equipment that we'd need to carry for hours at a time across difficult terrain. I threw myself into the preparation with an intensity that surprised even me. Morning PT sessions were followed by additional workouts in the gym. I spent hours at the firing range until I could put rounds exactly where I wanted them under any conditions. The combat medical training became particularly important to me. I'd seen enough training scenarios to know that knowing how to keep someone alive might be the difference between bringing everyone home and losing a teammate. David and I maintained our relationship through emails and phone calls, but the impending deployment added weight to every conversation. He'd received his own deployment orders to a different part of Afghanistan, which meant we'd be in the same country but might as well be on different planets, given the size of the area of operations. I keep thinking about that conversation we had about disappointing people to find out who you really are, he said during one of our last phone calls before deployment. "I think we're about to find out more about ourselves than we bargained for." The hardest conversation was with my family. Dad had been through combat deployments himself, so he understood what I was facing in ways that Mom and my brothers couldn't. But that understanding made him more worried, not less. "Sarah, I need you to promise me something," he said during our final phone call before I left for Afghanistan. "Promise me you'll remember that being brave doesn't mean being reckless. Your job is to do your mission and come home alive. Everything else is secondary." "I promise, Dad. And Sarah, I'm proud of you. I know I didn't always show it, but watching you become the soldier you are now, I was wrong about you being weak. You're stronger than any of us gave you credit for." Those words carried me through the final weeks of preparation. Equipment checks, medical examinations, legal preparations, and 1,000 other details that went into deploying an entire military police battalion to a combat zone. The last thing I did before boarding the transport plane was send a text message to my family. Heading out. See you in a year. Love you all. As the plane lifted off from Pope Air Force Base adjacent to Fort Bragg, I pressed my face to the small window and watched North Carolina disappear below us. Somewhere ahead lay Afghanistan, a year of challenges I couldn't imagine, and the test that would define everything I'd learned about myself since that Thanksgiving dinner when Dad called me delicate. I had no idea that in 6 months, I'd be dragging 4 wounded soldiers through enemy territory while mortars exploded around us. Or that helmet camera footage of that night would eventually be seen by 50 million people around the world. All I knew was that I was ready for whatever came next. Afghanistan hit me like stepping into an oven filled with dust and diesel fumes. Forward Operating Base Shank sat in the middle of Logar Province like a fortified island surrounded by mountains that seemed to stretch endlessly toward Pakistan. The landscape was more beautiful and more hostile than anything I'd imagined. Ancient valleys carved by rivers that had run dry decades ago, scattered compounds that could hide enemies or innocent families, and always the feeling that someone was watching from the ridgelines above. The first thing that struck me about Phoebe Shank was how loud it was. Generators hummed constantly, helicopters arrived and departed at all hours, and somewhere in the distance, you could always hear the rumble of heavy equipment or the crack of weapons fire from training ranges. But it was the silence between the noise that got to you, those moments when everything went quiet and you realized you were in a place where people were actively trying to kill you. My new squad included soldiers I'd never worked with before, drawn from different companies within the battalion. Sergeant First Class Maria Santos became our squad leader, a tough-as-nails woman from Texas who'd already completed 2 combat tours and had the kind of calm confidence that made everyone around her feel safer. "Listen up, people," she told us during our first squad meeting in a plywood-walled room that served as our briefing area. "This isn't training anymore. The people shooting at us aren't using blanks. And when someone gets hurt, there's no reset button. We take care of each other, we follow our training, and we all go home alive." Questions? My squad mates were a mixed group. Specialist Tommy Rodriguez was a 20-year-old from Phoenix who'd joined straight out of high school and had the kind of nervous energy that made him excellent at spotting threats but terrible at sitting still. Private First Class Michelle Wong was a former college student from Seattle who'd enlisted after her parents lost their restaurant in the recession. Corporal James Washington was a quiet guy from Alabama who'd grown up hunting and could hit targets at distances that seemed impossible. Our primary mission involved convoy security for supply runs between Phoebe Shank and smaller outposts scattered throughout the province. These weren't the heavily armored convoys you might see on the news. We rode in up-armored Humvees with mounted machine guns, but we were still vulnerable to roadside bombs, small arms fire, and rocket-propelled grenades. The first convoy was scheduled for my 3rd day in country. 23 vehicles carrying everything from ammunition to fresh water, medical supplies to mail from home. Our squad's job was to provide security for the middle section of the convoy, positioned to respond to threats from either direction. "Stay alert, but don't be jumpy," Sergeant Santos advised as we conducted pre-combat inspections on our vehicles. The locals are used to seeing coalition forces, but they're also watching to see how we behave. Professional, respectful, but ready for anything. The road to Combat Outpost Tillman wound through valleys that could have been postcards, if not for the burned-out vehicles and blast craters that marked previous IED attacks. Children waved from compound walls while their parents watched with expressions that revealed nothing. Shepherds guided flocks of goats across our path, seemingly oblivious to the armored vehicles waiting for them to pass. 2 hours into the convoy, Rodriguez's voice crackled through the radio from the lead vehicle. "Possible IED, 200 meters ahead. Fresh dirt on the roadway, looks like recent digging." The convoy halted while explosive ordnance disposal specialists moved forward to investigate. For 30 minutes, we sat in our vehicles scanning the surrounding hills for signs of enemy fighters positioning themselves for an ambush. The silence was deafening. No birds, no insects, just the tick of cooling engines and the whisper of wind through the valley. "False alarm," came the word from EOD. "Natural erosion, not an explosive device. Convoy moving." That false alarm taught me something important about combat operations. The majority of your time is spent dealing with potential threats that turn out to be nothing, but you have to treat each one as if it could kill you. The mental strain of constant vigilance was unlike anything I'd experienced in training. Over the following weeks, I settled into the rhythm of deployment life. Early morning briefings, where we studied intelligence reports about enemy activity in our area of operations. Equipment maintenance sessions, where we cleaned weapons and checked communications gear. Physical training adapted to the constraints of living on a forward operating base. Mostly bodyweight exercises and runs around the perimeter. The real education came from the veteran soldiers who'd been in Afghanistan for multiple deployments. They taught me to read the subtle signs that might indicate an ambush. Unusual absence of local traffic, children who disappeared too quickly, the way birds fell silent before an attack. They showed me how to position myself in a vehicle to minimize exposure while maintaining good fields of fire. Most importantly, they taught me that survival often depended on trusting your instincts, even when you couldn't articulate why something felt wrong. My first real contact with enemy fighters came 3 weeks into the deployment. Our squad was providing security for a medical team visiting a local clinic when small arms fire erupted from a compound about 400 meters away. The distinctive crack of Alaska 47 rounds passing overhead was unmistakable, followed immediately by the heavier thump of a rocket-propelled grenade that exploded against a concrete wall 30 feet from our position. Training took over. I found myself moving to cover behind our Humvee while simultaneously calling in the contact report over the radio. Contact, contact, contact. Grid reference follows. Small arms and RPG fire from compound to the northwest. No friendly casualties at this time. The firefight lasted maybe 10 minutes, though it felt like hours. Coalition air support arrived quickly, and the enemy fighters melted away into the maze of compounds and irrigation ditches that defined the local terrain. When it was over, I realized I'd performed exactly as trained without consciously thinking about any of it. Not bad for your first time getting shot at, Corporal Washington said as we conducted post-incident procedures. You kept your head down and did your job. That's all anyone can ask for. But it was the aftermath that really affected me. The medical team we'd been protecting had been treating local children when the attack started. One little girl, maybe 6 years old, had been terrified by the gunfire and was crying inconsolably while her mother tried to comfort her. Seeing the fear in that child's eyes drove home the reality that our presence, however well-intentioned, brought violence to places where families were just trying to live their lives. That night, I called David using one of the satellite phones available for morale calls. He was stationed at a different base, about 200 miles away, dealing with his own challenges as a combat medic. "How are you holding up?" he asked after I'd described the day's events. "I'm okay," I said, surprised to realize it was true. Scared, but okay. It's weird. Everything we trained for actually worked. But seeing how it affects the local people, that's harder to deal with than getting shot at. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That's the part they can't really prepare you for in training. Just remember why we're here and focus on taking care of your people." My squad became my family over the following months. We shared everything: meals, guard duty shifts, packages from home, fears about the dangers we faced daily. Rodriguez taught me Spanish curse words that made Sergeant Santos laugh despite herself. Wong shared care packages from her family's restaurant, including dried seaweed snacks that none of us could identify but everyone pretended to enjoy. Washington showed me how to clean weapons with an efficiency that bordered on art. The missions varied, but the risks remained constant. Convoy security operations that took us across the province. Checkpoint duty that required us to search vehicles while staying alert for suicide bombers. Patrol operations with infantry units that brought us into direct contact with local populations who might support us, tolerate us, or actively work against us. Each mission taught me something new about myself and about leadership under pressure. I learned to make quick decisions with incomplete information. I discovered that I could remain calm when others were panicking, and that my voice carried authority even when I didn't feel authoritative. Most importantly, I learned that the strength I developed wasn't just physical. It was mental, emotional, and spiritual. 6 months into the deployment, we received orders for a mission that would change everything. Intelligence reports indicated that a high-value Taliban commander was meeting with local cell leaders at a compound in a remote valley. Our job was to provide outer security, while Special Operations Forces conducted a raid to capture or eliminate the target. As we loaded our gear for what promised to be a routine mission, none of us could have imagined that before sunrise, I'd be dragging 4 wounded soldiers through enemy territory, while the world watched through helmet camera footage that would eventually reach 50 million viewers. The mission briefing took place at 2,100 hours in the Tactical Operations Center, a climate-controlled bunker filled with computer screens, radio equipment, and detailed maps of Logar Province. Major Patricia Hayes, our battalion commander, stood before 30 soldiers, representing different units that would participate in the operation. Intelligence indicates that Mullah Omar Ghazi will be meeting with 3 cell leaders tonight at Compound 47 Alpha, she began, pointing to a location on the digital map. Ghazi has been responsible for at least 15 IED attacks against coalition forces in the past 6 months, including the attack that killed 2 soldiers from the 173rd Airborne last month. The plan was complex but straightforward. Special Operations Forces would infiltrate the compound using helicopters, while conventional forces established a security perimeter to prevent enemy reinforcements from interfering with the raid. My squad's assignment placed us at Checkpoint Bravo, a hilltop position 3 miles from the target compound that would allow us to interdict any enemy fighters trying to escape or reinforce. Timeline is tight, Major Hayes continued. Birds lift off at 0200, insertion at 0230, raid commences at 0245. The expected duration is 30 minutes. But be prepared for complications. The weather forecast shows possible fog developing after 0300, which could affect helicopter operations. Sergeant Santos gathered our squad after the briefing for final preparations. "This is what we've been training for," she said, her voice carrying the kind of calm confidence that had made her an effective leader. "Rodriguez, you're on the radio. Wong, you've got the medical kit. Washington, you're our marksman. Mitchell, you're with me coordinating movement. Questions?" I checked my gear one final time. Body armor, helmet with night vision goggles, primary weapon with 6 magazines of ammunition, sidearm, medical supplies, water, and communications equipment. Everything had been inspected, tested, and positioned exactly where I could find it in the dark. The helmet camera that would eventually make me famous was just another piece of equipment, required for after-action review and documentation. The movement to Checkpoint Bravo began at 0130 hours. 4 up-armored Humvees carrying our squad and an additional 8 soldiers from an infantry platoon. The route took us through valleys. I traveled dozens of times during convoy operations, but tonight felt different. Radio chatter was minimal, vehicles maintained larger intervals, and everyone understood that contact with enemy forces was not just possible, but likely. Checkpoint Bravo sat on a ridgeline that provided excellent visibility over the target area and surrounding approaches. We established security positions among the rocks and sparse vegetation, settling in for what we expected to be a long night of watching and waiting. At exactly 0230, we heard the distant thump of helicopter rotors approaching the target compound. Through night vision equipment, we could see the aircraft, 2 Black Hawks carrying the assault force, and 2 Apache gunships providing overwatch. The insertion appeared to go smoothly, with no indication of enemy resistance. "All call signs, this is Overwatch," came the voice of the mission commander over our radio. "Insertion complete. Begin security operations." For 15 minutes, everything proceeded according to plan. The Special Operations team moved through the compound methodically, searching for the target and gathering intelligence. Our position remained quiet, with no movement detected on any of the approaches we were monitoring. Then Rodriguez's voice cut through the night air with the words every soldier dreads. "Contact, contact, contact. Multiple vehicles approaching from the northeast. Estimate 12 to 15 fighters." Through my night vision scope, I could see them, 3 pickup trucks loaded with armed men racing toward the target compound. But they weren't heading directly for the raid site. Their route would take them past our checkpoint, and they'd already spotted our position. "Bravo 6, this is Bravo 2, Sergeant Santos called to the mission commander. "Enemy reinforcements identified. We're in position to interdict, but they've made us. Request guidance. Bravo 2. You are cleared to engage. Prevent enemy reinforcement of the objective. What happened next unfolded with the chaotic precision of a well-rehearsed emergency. The lead enemy vehicle opened fire with a heavy machine gun mounted in its bed, sending tracers across our position. Washington responded immediately with precise rifle fire that disabled the driver. The vehicle crashed into a drainage ditch, but the fighters inside were still combat effective. The second and third vehicles deployed their occupants in a coordinated assault on our position. These weren't untrained militants. They moved with the discipline of experienced fighters, using cover and concealment while advancing under supporting fire. "Wang, get on the radio and call for air support," Santos shouted over the sound of incoming rounds. "Rodriguez, suppress that machine gun position. Washington, keep picking off anyone who tries to flank us." The firefight intensified rapidly. Enemy fighters were using rocket-propelled grenades to flush us from our defensive positions, while small arms fire forced us to keep our heads down. But we held our ground, returning disciplined fire that kept the enemy from overrunning our checkpoint. That's when the mortar rounds started falling. The first explosion landed 50 meters from our position, showering us with rocks and debris. The second was closer, maybe 30 meters. Someone in the enemy force had called in indirect fire support, and they were walking the rounds toward our location with deadly accuracy. "We need to move," Santos called out. "This position is compromised. Prepare to be bound back to secondary positions." But as we began to move, the third mortar round landed directly among the vehicles we'd used to reach the checkpoint. The explosion was deafening, and the flash temporarily overloaded our night vision equipment. When my vision cleared, I saw something that would haunt me forever. 4 soldiers from the infantry platoon had been caught in the blast. Specialist Ryan Murphy from Ohio was unconscious, blood streaming from a head wound. Private First Class Kevin Martinez from California had shrapnel wounds in both legs and was screaming for a medic. Sergeant Michael Thompson from Georgia was trying to apply pressure to a sucking chest wound while directing his remaining soldiers. Most critically, Corporal Lisa Davis from Texas was trapped under debris from one of the destroyed vehicles, conscious but unable to move. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Enemy fighters were advancing on our position under cover of continued mortar fire. Our vehicles were destroyed, which meant we had no way to evacuate the wounded. Radio communications with higher headquarters were intermittent due to the mountainous terrain. And the fog that weather forecasters had predicted was beginning to roll into the valley, which would prevent helicopter evacuation. "Mitchell, get over here," Santos called. "We need to get these wounded back to the casualty collection point at Grid 41 SUB 12,300 45-6 7890. That's 3 miles through enemy territory, but it's our only option for helicopter pickup." I looked at the 4 wounded soldiers, calculating weight and distance and time. Murphy was unconscious and would need to be carried. Martinez could walk with assistance, but would slow our movement significantly. Thompson was ambulatory but needed medical attention. Davis was the most critically injured and would require a stretcher or direct carry. "Sergeant, I can't carry all 4 of them," I said, stating what seemed like an obvious tactical reality. "You're not carrying all 4, she replied. "Rodriguez and Wang will take Murphy and Martinez. Washington and I will establish a rear guard and follow with Thompson. You take Davis." I looked at Corporal Davis, who was conscious but obviously in severe pain. She probably weighed 140 pounds, and with her gear, we were looking at close to 180 pounds of dead weight. 3 miles through mountainous terrain while under fire from an unknown number of enemy fighters. "Can you do this, Mitchell?" Santos asked, and I could hear both concern and confidence in her voice. I thought about my family back in Bakersfield, about all the times they'd told me I wasn't strong enough, about Dad's Thanksgiving dinner comment about me being delicate. I thought about the past year of training and deployment, about everything I'd learned about myself and my capabilities. "I can do this," I said, and meant it completely. That's when I picked up Corporal Lisa Davis and began the longest 3 miles of my life, while enemy mortars exploded around us, and my helmet camera recorded everything that would eventually be seen by 50 million people around the world. The first 100 yards were the hardest, not because of the weight, though Corporal Davis felt like she weighed twice what I'd expected, but because every step took us further from our destroyed vehicles and deeper into territory where enemy fighters could be waiting in ambush. The helmet camera bounced with each step, recording a disorienting view of rocky terrain, muzzle flashes in the distance, and the occasional glimpse of Davis's pale face as she fought to stay conscious. "Stay with me, Davis," I whispered, adjusting my grip under her arms. "We're getting out of here." "Mitchell," she gasped, her voice barely audible over the sound of continuing gunfire behind us. "Leave me. You can't carry me 3 miles. "Watch me," I replied and kept moving. The terrain worked against us from the beginning. The route to the casualty collection point led down the ridgeline we'd occupied, across a valley floor, cut by irrigation ditches and scattered compounds, then up another series of hills to the pickup zone. In daylight with full mobility, it would have been a challenging hike. At night, under fire, carrying a wounded soldier, it seemed impossible. But impossible had stopped meaning anything to me months ago. Behind us, the firefight continued as Sergeant Santos and the others fought to break contact with the enemy force. Radio chatter filled my earpiece with urgent calls for close air support, medical evacuation, and ammunition resupply. The Special Operations raid on the target compound had been successful. They'd captured 2 high-value targets and killed several others. But now, multiple coalition units were engaged with enemy forces across a 5-mile area. The first checkpoint came after 20 minutes of movement. Rodriguez and Wong had reached the same position with Specialist Murphy, who was regaining consciousness but remained disoriented from his head injury. Private Martinez was walking on his own, though his shrapnel wounds were leaving a blood trail that worried me. "How are you holding up, Mitchell?" Rodriguez asked, his voice betraying concern as he watched me lower Davis to the ground for a brief rest. "I'm good," I said, though my shoulders were already screaming and we hadn't covered a third of the distance yet. "Davis needs medical attention fast. That chest wound is getting worse." Wong, who'd had the most medical training among us, conducted a quick assessment of Davis's condition. Her breathing was labored, and the makeshift pressure bandage over her chest wound was soaked with blood. "She's got a pneumothorax," Wong said quietly. "Collapsed lung. If we don't get her to a surgeon soon." She didn't need to finish the sentence. We all understood that Davis was dying, and our march through enemy territory was her only chance of survival. The second segment of the journey took us across the valley floor, where irrigation ditches provided both concealment and obstacles. Each ditch required careful navigation. I couldn't simply jump across while carrying Davis, so every crossing meant finding a place where the banks were low enough to climb down and up while maintaining my grip on her. It was during one of these crossings that we encountered our first direct enemy contact since leaving the checkpoint. Muzzle flashes erupted from a compound about 200 meters to our east, and bullets cracked over our heads as we scrambled for cover in the drainage ditch. "Contact right," Rodriguez called over the radio, "taking fire from compound 23, Bravo." Murphy, despite his head injury, was alert enough to return fire with his rifle while Wong applied fresh bandages to Martinez's leg wounds. I found myself in the surreal position of shielding Davis with my body while trying to identify targets through my night vision scope. The engagement lasted maybe 5 minutes, though it felt like hours. Our return fire was disciplined and effective, forcing the enemy fighters to keep their heads down while we moved to a more defensible position. But the delay cost us precious time, and I could feel Davis getting weaker with each passing minute. "We need to move," I told the others. "Davis can't wait for us to clear every compound between here and the pickup zone." What happened next would be captured in perfect detail by my helmet camera, though I wouldn't see the footage until weeks later. Rodriguez and Wong took point, moving ahead to scout the route and identify potential threats. Murphy, functioning despite his concussion, provided rear security. Martinez, bleeding but determined, stayed close to provide assistance if I needed help with Davis. And I just kept walking. Step after step, meter after meter, carrying a fellow soldier who outweighed me by 30 pounds plus her full combat load. My legs burned, my back ached, and my lungs felt like they were on fire in the thin mountain air. But I'd found a rhythm that seemed sustainable, a measured pace that covered ground without exhausting me completely. The worst moment came during the 3rd mile, as we climbed toward the casualty collection point. Davis had been unconscious for the past 20 minutes, and her breathing had become increasingly shallow. Wong had warned me that we might lose her before reaching medical care, but I refused to accept that possibility. That's when the enemy mortars found us again. The first round landed 50 meters behind us, sending rock fragments whizzing through the air like deadly confetti. The second was closer. Close enough that the blast wave knocked me to my knees while still holding Davis. "Incoming," Murphy yelled, though we could all hear the distinctive whistle of more rounds in the air. I made a decision that probably saved all our lives. Instead of seeking cover and waiting for the barrage to end, I kept moving toward the pickup zone. The enemy mortar crew was firing at where we had been, not where we were going. By maintaining forward movement, we stayed ahead of their targeting adjustments. The final 500 meters were a nightmare of loose rock, steep inclines, and the constant fear that Davis had died in my arms. Her body had gone completely limp, and I couldn't tell if she was breathing. But I kept climbing, kept carrying her, because the alternative was unthinkable. Rodriguez's voice in my earpiece was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. Casualty collection point in sight, medical personnel standing by. The pickup zone was a flat area on a hilltop that had been cleared for helicopter operations. Portable lights marked the landing zone, and I could see medical personnel waiting with stretchers and equipment. But the most important sight was the Black Hawk helicopter sitting on the ground with its rotors turning, ready for immediate evacuation. I stumbled the final 50 meters and collapsed to my knees as medics took Davis from my arms. They immediately began working on her chest wound while calling out medical terminology I didn't understand. Other medics attended to Murphy, Martinez, and even Rodriguez, who'd taken shrapnel from one of the mortar rounds without telling anyone. "Is she going to make it?" I asked the senior medic, a gruff sergeant who'd probably seen more combat casualties than he cared to remember. "You got her here in time," he said, not looking up from his work. "Another 10 minutes and we'd have been too late. Hell of a thing you did, soldier." As the helicopter lifted off with our wounded, I finally allowed myself to feel the full extent of what had just happened. My shoulders felt like they'd been dislocated and reattached. My legs shook uncontrollably from exhaustion. My hands were cramped from maintaining my grip on Davis for 3 hours of continuous movement. But we'd made it. All of us. Rodriguez, Wong, Murphy, Martinez, Davis. Everyone was alive and on their way to medical care. It wasn't until days later that I learned about the helmet camera footage. The 3-hour recording of our movement from the destroyed checkpoint to the casualty collection point had been automatically uploaded to the Army's after-action review system. Someone in the intelligence section had noticed the footage and passed it up the chain of command. From there, it had somehow found its way to military journalists, then to mainstream news outlets, and finally to social media platforms where it spread like wildfire. The image of a small female soldier carrying a wounded comrade 3 miles through enemy territory, while under fire, resonated with people around the world in ways I never could have anticipated. But that night, exhausted and shaking on a hilltop in Afghanistan, all I could think about was a Thanksgiving dinner 2 years earlier, when my father had called me delicate. I thought about all the times my family had told me I wasn't strong enough, all the limitations they'd placed on my capabilities based on my size and gender. And I smiled, because I finally knew exactly what I was made of. The rescue helicopter's rotors cut through the Afghan night as we lifted off from the casualty collection point, but my war was far from over. Below us, the valley where we'd fought for our lives disappeared into darkness, while ahead lay medical facilities, debriefings, and eventually the long journey home. What I couldn't have predicted was that our 3-hour march through enemy territory had been captured in high-definition video that would change my life in ways I never imagined. The first indication that something unusual was happening came 3 days later at Forward Operating Base Shank. I was recovering from severe dehydration and muscle strain when Sergeant First Class Martinez, our company's senior enlisted advisor, appeared at my bedside in the aid station. "Mitchell, you need to see this," he said, holding up a tablet computer. "Your little night walk has gone viral." The footage was surreal to watch. The helmet camera had captured everything with unflinching clarity. The explosions, the weight of Davis in my arms, the stumbling climb up that final hillside. But what struck me most was hearing my own voice throughout the recording, calm and steady even when mortars were exploding around us. I sounded nothing like the uncertain young woman who'd left California 2 years earlier. 50 million views and counting, Martinez continued. News outlets are calling it the most compelling combat footage since the invasion. They want to interview you. The media attention was overwhelming and unwelcome. I joined the army to prove something to myself, not to become a poster child for female soldiers in combat roles. But the requests kept coming. CNN, Fox News, NBC, even international outlets from Britain and Australia. Military public affairs officers tried to manage the flood of interview requests while I focused on recovering and preparing for the remainder of our deployment. The real impact became clear when I received a video message from my family. All of them, Mom, Dad, Jake, Marcus, and Tony, were crowded around a computer screen in Dad's garage, the same place where they'd dismissed my capabilities so many times before. Sarah, Dad began, his voice thick with emotion, I watched that footage a dozen times. What you did over there, carrying Davis, keeping everyone together under fire. I've been a Marine for 20 years and I've never seen anything like it. Mom was crying openly. We were so wrong about you, sweetheart. So wrong. You're the strongest person in this family. And it took us way too long to see it. Even Jake, who'd bet money that I'd wash out of basic training, seemed genuinely humbled. Sis, I owe you an apology. We all do. You proved that courage doesn't have anything to do with size or gender. It comes from something deeper, and you've got more of it than the rest of us combined. The messages of support weren't limited to family. Letters arrived from strangers across America, parents of soldiers, veterans from previous wars, young women who said my story had inspired them to pursue careers they'd previously considered impossible. One letter that particularly moved me came from a 15-year-old girl in Ohio whose parents had discouraged her from trying out for her high school wrestling team. Dear Sergeant Mitchell, she wrote, I watched your video with my dad, who's always told me girls aren't built for contact sports. After seeing what you did in Afghanistan, he signed the permission slip for wrestling tryouts. Thank you for showing me that being small doesn't mean being weak. But the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. David Chen had managed to get communication privileges to send me a message from his base in eastern Afghanistan. His words were simple but carried the weight of everything we'd shared during our training and the relationship we'd maintained across combat zones. Sarah, I knew you were strong when we met at MP school. I knew you were brave when you deployed to Afghanistan. But watching that footage showed me something I'd never seen before. You're a natural leader who brings out the best in everyone around you. When this deployment ends, I want to spend the rest of my life learning from your example. The remainder of our deployment passed with a strange mixture of routine and celebrity. Normal military police operations continued. Convoy security, checkpoint duty, base patrol. But now I was frequently recognized by soldiers from other units who'd seen the viral footage. Some wanted autographs, others wanted to hear the full story, and a few challenged me to arm wrestling matches that I politely declined. More importantly, the dynamic within my own unit had shifted. Younger soldiers sought my advice on handling combat stress and maintaining composure under fire. Senior non-commissioned officers included me in leadership discussions that would normally exclude someone of my rank. I found myself mentoring soldiers who'd initially dismissed me as the quote, girl playing soldier. The transformation wasn't just external. Something fundamental had changed inside me during those 3 hours, carrying Davis through enemy territory. The doubt that had plagued me since childhood, the nagging voice that whispered I wasn't strong enough, tough enough, capable enough, had been permanently silenced. I'd faced the ultimate test and discovered reserves of strength I never knew existed. 3 months before our scheduled redeployment, I received orders that would define the next phase of my military career. The Army was offering me a slot at Officer Candidate School, with the recommendation that I pursue a commission in the Military Police Corps. The letter, signed by my battalion commander, included a note that made my chest swell with pride. Sergeant Mitchell has demonstrated exceptional leadership under the most challenging combat conditions. Her performance during Operation Mountain Strike exemplifies the warrior ethos and serves as an inspiration to all soldiers. She is strongly recommended for commissioning as an officer in the United States Army. The decision to accept the commission wasn't difficult. I discovered that leadership came naturally to me, and I wanted to use that ability to help develop the next generation of soldiers. But first, I had to complete my deployment and return home to face a family and community that now saw me very differently than when I'd left. The redeployment ceremony at FOB Shank was both a celebration and memorial. We'd completed our mission successfully, disrupted numerous enemy operations, and contributed to the overall security of Logar Province. But we'd also lost 2 soldiers during the deployment, and several others bore permanent physical and psychological scars from their service. As I packed my gear for the journey home, I reflected on how much had changed since that uncertain young woman had first arrived in Afghanistan. The desert camouflage uniforms were faded and patched. My equipment bore the scratches and dents of constant use. But the most significant changes weren't visible. They were etched in confidence, carved in competence, and forged in the fires of combat leadership. The flight home reversed the journey I'd taken 13 months earlier, but this time I wasn't traveling toward an uncertain future. I knew exactly who I was and what I was capable of achieving. The plane carried soldiers who'd been tested in ways civilian life could never replicate, and we'd all passed that test according to our own measures. Landing at Fort Bragg felt like arriving in a foreign country. The same buildings, the same North Carolina humidity, the same sounds of military aircraft overhead. But I was seeing it through different eyes. Not as a nervous young soldier trying to prove herself, but as a combat veteran with hard-won experience and unshakable confidence. The homecoming ceremony filled the main post auditorium with families who'd waited 13 months for this moment. My parents had flown in from California, along with Jake and his wife Amanda. They looked older than I remembered, worn down by months of worry about my safety in a combat zone. But when they saw me in dress uniform with combat patches and decorations earned in Afghanistan, their faces lit up with pride I'd never seen before. "You look different," Mom said during our first private conversation after the ceremony. "Stronger, more confident, I guess." "I feel different," I replied, adjusting the combat action badge on my uniform. "I feel like myself for the first time in my life." Dad's reaction was more complex. As a Marine veteran, he understood the significance of what I'd accomplished in ways that the rest of the family couldn't fully grasp. But he also carried guilt about the years he'd spent underestimating my capabilities. "Sarah, I need to say something I should have said years ago," he began, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. "I was wrong about you. Wrong about your strength, wrong about your potential, wrong about what you could accomplish. I let my protective instincts blind me to who you really were, and I'm sorry." "Dad, you don't need to apologize," I said, meaning it completely. "You were trying to protect me from a world you thought was too dangerous for someone my size. But sometimes people need to face danger to discover what they're really made of." The transition back to civilian interactions proved more challenging than I'd anticipated. Simple activities like grocery shopping or visiting restaurants felt surreal after months of living on a fortified military base. I found myself automatically scanning for potential threats, positioning myself with clear sight lines to exits, and feeling uncomfortable in crowds of strangers. But the most difficult adjustment was dealing with the continued media attention. The helmet camera footage had spawned documentaries, magazine articles, and speaking requests from organizations across the country. Everyone wanted to hear about the night that changed everything, but I struggled to articulate how carrying Davis through enemy territory was just one moment in a longer journey of self-discovery. The invitation that changed my perspective came from an unexpected source. The Girl Scouts of America asked me to speak at their national convention about overcoming limitations and pursuing dreams that others might consider impossible. Initially, I planned to decline. What could I tell a group of young girls about scouting and cookies? But when I arrived at the convention center in Denver and saw 3,000 girls aged 10 to 18, I understood why my story might matter to them. These were young women at the beginning of their journeys, many of them already hearing voices that told them what they couldn't do, what wasn't appropriate for girls, what was too dangerous or difficult or demanding. "How many of you have been told you're not strong enough for something you wanted to try?" I asked during my keynote address. Hundreds of hands shot up across the auditorium. "How many have been told that girls aren't built for certain activities?" Even more hands. How many have accepted those limitations without testing them for yourselves? Fewer hands this time, but still too many. For the next hour, I shared my story. Not the dramatic combat footage that had made me famous, but the longer journey of overcoming internal and external limitations. I talked about the importance of testing your own boundaries, rather than accepting other people's assumptions. I emphasized that strength comes in many forms, and that courage is often about continuing forward when you're afraid rather than feeling no fear at all. The question and answer session that followed reminded me why I'd joined the military in the first place. These young women weren't looking for someone to tell them what they couldn't do. They'd heard enough of that already. They wanted someone to show them what was possible when you refused to accept limitations that weren't based on reality. Sergeant Mitchell asked a 16-year-old from Michigan, "What would you tell parents who want to protect their daughters from dangerous or difficult challenges?" I thought about Dad's protective instincts, about all the times my family had intervened to keep me safe from activities that might have helped me discover my capabilities years earlier. I'd tell them that the greatest danger isn't physical harm. It's never discovering what you're truly capable of achieving. Protection is important, but it shouldn't come at the cost of growth and self-discovery. Sometimes the safest thing you can do is learn to handle dangerous situations rather than avoiding them completely. Following the Girl Scout convention, speaking requests multiplied exponentially. Military organizations wanted me to address leadership development. Women's groups requested presentations about breaking gender barriers. High schools invited me to speak about perseverance and goal setting. Corporate conferences sought my perspective on performance under pressure. Each speaking engagement reinforced the same fundamental lesson. Most limitations are self-imposed or socially constructed rather than based on actual capabilities. The young woman who'd accepted her family's assessment of her as delicate had been artificially constrained by assumptions that had no basis in reality. Officer Candidate School at Fort Benning, Georgia, represented the next phase of my military career and personal development. The 12-week program was designed to transform enlisted soldiers into commissioned officers. But for me, it was validation of a transformation that had already occurred. The physical training was demanding but manageable after my combat deployment. The academic requirements played to my educational background. The leadership exercises felt natural rather than forced. What challenged me most was learning to see myself as others now saw me, not as someone trying to prove herself, but as someone whose capabilities had already been demonstrated under the most demanding circumstances. My tactical officers, the senior soldiers responsible for training officer candidates, treated me with a respect that would have been unimaginable 2 years earlier. They'd all seen the helmet camera footage and understood that I'd already been tested in ways that most officers would never experience. "Mitchell," said Major Rebecca Torres during a counseling session halfway through the program, "you came here with more practical leadership experience than most lieutenants acquire in their first 3 years of commissioned service. Our job isn't to teach you how to lead, it's to help you understand how to lead in garrison environments rather than combat zones." The observation was astute. Combat leadership and peacetime leadership require different skills, and I'd been developing the former without much exposure to the latter. Learning to motivate soldiers through training rather than survival, to enforce standards during routine operations rather than life-or-death situations, to balance mission requirements with quality-of-life concerns. These were new challenges that required adaptation of my natural leadership instincts. Graduation from Officer Candidate School brought another homecoming ceremony, this time with me wearing the gold bars of a second lieutenant. My family's pride was now mixed with genuine respect, and conversations had evolved from protective concern to curious interest in my career plans and professional aspirations. My first assignment as a commissioned officer took me to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, home of the 101st Airborne Division. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was returning to an area where David Chen was stationed, though he'd been promoted to staff sergeant and was now working as a senior medical trainer. Our reunion felt like completing a circle that had begun during MP school 3 years earlier. We'd both deployed to Afghanistan, both been tested by combat, both emerged with clearer understanding of our capabilities and goals. The relationship that had been maintained through emails and satellite phone calls could now develop in person. You know, David said during one of our first dinners together after my arrival at Fort Campbell, when I first met you at Leonard Wood, I thought you were trying to prove something to everyone else. Now I realize you were trying to prove something to yourself. And did I succeed? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Beyond anything you could have imagined, he replied, but the best part is that you're not done. This is just the beginning. He was right. My military career was entering a new phase, with opportunities for advanced training, deployment to new theaters of operation, and leadership positions that would allow me to mentor the next generation of soldiers. The young woman who'd been told she couldn't carry groceries without help was now responsible for training soldiers who might face combat operations around the world. But the most important transformation wasn't professional, it was personal. I'd finally silenced the voice that whispered limitations and replaced it with the knowledge that capabilities are discovered through challenge rather than comfort. The helmet camera footage that had made me famous was captured one night in Afghanistan, but it represented years of growth, months of training, and the decision to test my boundaries rather than accept them. As I settled into my new role as a platoon leader in the 716th Military Police Battalion, I often thought about that Thanksgiving dinner when Dad had called me delicate. The comment that had once wounded me so deeply now seemed like an observation about someone I'd never really been, someone who'd accepted other people's limitations as facts about herself. The real Sarah Mitchell had been waiting all along, buried under years of protective restrictions and social expectations. It had taken the Army, combat deployment, and 3 hours carrying a wounded soldier through enemy territory to excavate her, but she'd been there the entire time. And now, finally, she was free. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.